What if a quiet life at the edge of the Cascade Mountains could be changed forever by something no one could have imagined? In a small cabin tucked near the town of Pineford, 78-year-old Grace Harper had spent years surrounded by silence that felt both comforting and heavy. A rhythm shaped by long winters and the lingering memory of her husband Thomas, whose presence still lived in the worn floorboards and the old rocking chair on the porch. Grace had been a beloved elementary school teacher for more than 4 decades, and even in retirement, the community felt stitched into her life through familiar faces like Sheriff Daniel Brooks, who stopped by to check on her, and her daughter Emily, who called from Seattle with gentle worries about her living alone. Yet, despite their care, Grace often found herself moving through days marked by quiet routines, tending her small garden or sorting jars in her pantry, believing that this was simply the way life would continue. But on an early spring morning, as the snow melt soaked into the ground and the mountains carried a faint hint of renewal, something unexpected approached her doorstep. Something that would shift her solitude into a story of purpose she never knew she still carried. And the peaceful world she had built was about to open into something far larger than she ever imagined. What could possibly arrive on a quiet spring morning that would shift a 78-year-old woman's life into a story no one in Pineford would ever forget? That question echoed in Grace Harper's mind as she wiped the soil from her hands and looked up at the sound of an approaching truck rumbling along her long gravel driveway. The steady crunch of tires against damp earth carried a sense of urgency she did not hear often. When the familiar green pickup finally stopped near her garden, she recognized it immediately as the vehicle belonging to Evan Mitchell, the Pineford game warden and one of her former students, a boy she once remembered as shy and observant, with eyes that always wandered to the classroom window. Now, decades later, he carried the same look of quiet intensity, and as he stepped out of the truck, Grace sensed that something was different. She greeted him with the warmth she offered to all former students, but before she could ask about his unexpected arrival, he lifted a wooden crate from the passenger seat with a deep, steadying breath. Inside the box, 4 tiny bodies shifted, trembling beneath a layer of blankets. Grace leaned closer, her breath catching as she saw 4 bobcat kittens pressed together for warmth, their spotted fur still soft with youth, and their eyes a bright baby blue that glimmered beneath the morning light. They could not have been more than a few weeks old. Each small movement revealed how fragile they were, how desperately they clung to the last traces of safety they remembered. Evan explained that their mother had been struck by a logging truck near Ridge Road, and by the time he reached the site, the only signs of her were the kittens hidden inside a hollow log. He spoke quietly, with a kind of heaviness that came from witnessing too much hardship in the wilderness, and Grace listened with the compassionate steadiness she had offered to countless children throughout her teaching years. When Evan admitted that the Wildlife Rehabilitation Center in Portland was overwhelmed and could not take the kittens for at least 2 weeks, Grace understood the unspoken plea behind his words. He needed someone who was patient, meticulous, and gentle enough to care for wild creatures that required round-the-clock attention, and he believed that person was her. As Grace looked at the kittens again, something stirred inside her. Something she had not felt since the years of raising her daughter Emily and nurturing Thomas through long winters. It was the quiet pull of purpose, a sense that these small beings needed her in a way nothing else had since her husband passed. Evan warned her that these were not house cats and must be raised with the goal of returning to the wild, but Grace already felt her heart leaning toward them. She agreed to help, even knowing that temporary care often led to deeper attachment. And as she carried the crate inside her cabin, she felt the weight of a new chapter beginning. The first hours were filled with careful learning. Evan brought formula, syringes, heating pads, and a guide to wildlife rehabilitation. Grace studied every detail, determined to give the kittens a chance at life. She created a warm nest in her spare bedroom, adjusting blankets and monitoring the heating pad, ensuring the space felt safe and secure. Feeding them every few hours required intense focus. She held each kitten gently, guiding the syringe so they could drink without choking, listening to their tiny sounds of hunger and relief. Cleaning them with a warm cloth reminded her of caring for newborns years ago, the rhythmic tenderness of a mother's touch returning instinctively. In those first nights, she watched as their tiny bodies stretched, relaxed, and settled into sleep, each breath small but determined. As the days passed, the kittens began to reveal their personalities. The largest male with reddish fur quickly became Copper, bold but thoughtful. The smallest female, always mewling for attention, became Willow. The curious male, constantly exploring beyond the blankets, became Blaze. And the cautious female, whose eyes missed nothing, became Misty. Grace knew naming them was a step toward attachment, yet she could not help herself. Names gave identity, and identity made caring feel purposeful. Her days shifted into new rhythms built around feeding times, soft purrs, and small victories as the kittens grew stronger. Her nights no longer felt long or empty because the cabin pulsed with new life. Even as Emily questioned the safety of raising wild animals, Grace assured her that she understood the risks. What she did not say was that caring for the kittens had opened a space in her heart she believed had closed forever. The snow continued to melt, the earth thawed, and the Cascade wind carried the scent of spring. Inside the cabin, 4 small bobcats found warmth and survival, and Grace Harper found the beginning of something unexpected, something that felt like hope returning in the gentlest of forms. What happens when the very creatures you saved begin growing into something the world never intended you to keep? That question rose slowly in Grace Harper's mind as the weeks passed and the 4 bobcat kittens she had nurtured with such devotion transformed before her eyes. Their legs lengthened, their movements sharpened, and their play took on the unmistakable edge of wildness. The once soft mews that filled her spare bedroom deepened into small, throaty chirps. And though she loved them dearly, Grace knew these sounds were reminders that they belonged to a world far beyond the walls of her cabin. Copper was the first to show signs of change. His reddish coat thickened, his steps became powerful and precise, and his eyes, once bright blue, shifted into a piercing shade of gold that hinted at the predator he was meant to be. Blaze grew more daring each day, climbing the bookshelf, leaping off the bed, testing every boundary with fearless curiosity. Willow remained affectionate but louder, demanding attention with her insistent calls. And Misty, ever watchful, observed everything with a quiet intelligence that made Grace wonder just how much these young bobcats understood about the world around them. As their instincts strengthened, so did Grace's awareness that she could not keep them inside forever. Her daughter Emily warned her gently that wild animals would eventually grow stronger than her ability to manage them. And even Evan Mitchell, though impressed by their progress, reminded her that the ultimate goal was to prepare them for release. These conversations weighed heavily on Grace's heart. She did not want to lose them, but she also knew love sometimes meant letting go. The transition began when Evan suggested building an outdoor enclosure, a space where the bobcats could stretch their legs, practice climbing, learn the subtle language of wind and shadows, and begin distancing themselves from the human comfort they had grown to depend on. With the help of a few Pineford neighbors who had heard vague hints of Grace's unusual house guests, Evan constructed a large enclosure beside her cabin, complete with sturdy fencing, climbing branches, hollow logs, and patches of natural earth that allowed the kittens to explore safely. Moving them outside was harder than Grace expected. The moment she stepped back after placing them in their new space, the kittens pressed themselves against the fence, confused by the barrier that separated them from her warmth. Their cries broke her heart, yet she reminded herself that this was the first step in giving them the life nature intended. To prevent them from imprinting too strongly on her, Grace began limiting her interactions. She wore a mask when entering the enclosure to feed them, avoided speaking to them directly, and reduced her time inside the fenced space. She shifted their diet from soft formula to whole prey, first offering store-bought mice, then small rabbits as they grew stronger. The sight of them pouncing, wrestling, and practicing stealth stirred mixed feelings within her. Pride at their growing strength wove tightly with the ache of knowing each new skill brought them closer to leaving her. She watched them from her cabin window during quiet afternoons, marveling at how their personalities emerged even more sharply in their outdoor world. Copper, steady and calm, often took the highest perch. Blaze darted through the enclosure with reckless joy. Willow chirped loudly whenever a shadow moved, and Misty kept a patient watch from behind a log, her gaze always alert. Despite her efforts to distance herself, Grace found it impossible to remain fully separate from the kittens. Some evenings, overwhelmed by the hush of the mountains around her, she carried a book to the chair beside the enclosure and read aloud, her voice weaving into the twilight air. She noticed Copper often settled closest to the fence when she did, his ears flicking with each rise and fall of her tone. Though she knew it blurred the line between human and wild, the small ritual soothed her loneliness and reminded her that connection, even unspoken, was a gift that did not diminish their future freedom. As summer approached, the kittens grew large and confident, almost the size of house cats, but with a wild grace that signaled they were nearly ready for the next stage. Grace felt the shift in the air, sensed the nearing moment when they would no longer be hers to protect. It was the same quiet recognition she felt the day Emily left for college, a bittersweet blend of pride and loss. Each day inside the enclosure taught them independence, but it also taught Grace something unexpected about herself, that even in her late 70s, she still had room in her heart for change, resilience, and the kind of love that asks for nothing in return. What happens when the moment you have been preparing for finally arrives, yet your heart refuses to believe it is time to let go? That question lingered in Grace Harper's thoughts as summer warmed the Cascade Mountains, and the 4 bobcats she had raised grew into sleek, powerful adolescents, their golden eyes sharp with instinct, their limbs strong with the confidence of creatures meant to roam the wild. Every sign pointed toward the next step, yet Grace found herself hesitating each time she imagined the enclosure standing empty. Evan Mitchell arrived one warm July morning with news she knew would eventually come. The Wildlife Rehabilitation Center finally had space, and the time had come to move Copper, Willow, Blaze, and Misty into the final stage of their transition. Grace stood beside the enclosure, watching the bobcats move through shafts of sunlight, their spotted coats shimmering as they leapt across branches, and she felt a familiar squeeze in her chest. The same sensation she once felt when watching her daughter Emily walk through the airport security line before moving to Seattle. She knew release was the right choice, the only choice, but understanding did not soften the ache of farewell. The capture process was far more difficult than Grace imagined. The bobcats, though raised by her, had grown cautious of close human contact, a sign that the transition had worked. Evan arrived with 2 assistants from the rehabilitation center, carrying transport crates lined with straw and blankets, and together they entered the enclosure. The bobcats reacted with a mix of fear and defiance. Blaze darted between logs, Willow hissed sharply from the shadows, Misty retreated into the highest perch, and Copper braced himself with a low growl that trembled with warning. Grace watched from outside, her hands clenched together, murmuring gentle encouragement, even though she knew they could no longer rely on her voice for comfort. After nearly 2 hours of patient maneuvering, the team managed to safely secure Willow first, then Misty. Blaze took even longer, weaving in and out of hiding spots with quick bursts of energy, but eventually he was guided into his crate. Copper was last, and as Evan gently closed the door behind him, Copper let out a low hiss that sliced through Grace's heart. She knew it was not meant for her, yet the echo of it felt like a closing chapter. When the truck finally pulled away, carrying the 4 young bobcats toward their new temporary home, Grace stood on her porch feeling a profound quiet settle over her property. The enclosure seemed larger somehow, too large for the silence that filled it. And for the first time in months, the rhythm of her days no longer revolved around the soft demands of little voices depending on her. With autumn approaching, Grace eased herself back into old routines. She harvested tomatoes from her garden, jarred apples from her orchard, joined a local book club at the Pineford Senior Center, and continued her tradition of baking cookies for the elementary school fundraiser. Yet even as she returned to familiar comforts, she found herself pausing during the quieter moments, glancing instinctively toward the enclosure as though expecting to see 4 spotted shadows prowling through leaves. Sheriff Daniel Brooks visited often, bringing updates he gathered through the county radio. The Bobcats were adjusting well at the rehabilitation center, their hunting abilities improving, their instincts sharpening. Evan stopped by with even more detailed reports, telling her how impressed the staff were by their unusual bond. Unlike typical siblings, the 4 stayed together, moved together, and sometimes hunted cooperatively in the large outdoor environment. Grace smiled each time she heard this, imagining Copper leading the group or Blaze teasing them into play, imagining Willow chirping its shadows, and Misty analyzing every movement with quiet calculation. Those updates soothed her longing, but also reminded her that her part in their lives, while meaningful, was never meant to be permanent. As autumn deepened, pine needles carpeted the ground, and the mountains blazed with shades of gold and red, Grace felt herself settling into a gentle acceptance. She had given the Bobcats everything she could, and now they belonged to the wild that had shaped them. Still, even with that understanding, she could not bring herself to dismantle the enclosure. It stood behind her cabin like an empty cradle, a reminder that a piece of her heart had once lived there. Then winter arrived, with its stark quiet and heavy snowfall, the kind that pressed against windows and isolated mountain residents for days at a time. Grace prepared as she always did, stocking her pantry, stacking firewood, and calling Emily to reassure her that everything was fine. But no amount of preparation could have foretold what would happen next. On a night when the wind clawed fiercely at the corners of her cabin and snow drifted high across her porch, an unexpected sound broke through the storm. The slow grind of tires climbing her driveway. Grace set aside her book, her instincts sharpening with unease, because she knew that no one from Pineford would be traveling in such dangerous weather unless something was terribly wrong. She moved toward the window, unaware that the next few moments would thrust her into a danger far greater than the wilderness she had always respected. What if the danger you fear the least is the one that finds you first, and the help you never expected is already on its way through the storm? That thought barely had time to take shape as Grace Harper watched 2 unfamiliar men step from a pickup truck she did not recognize, their intentions revealed not by their words, but by the hard, restless look in their eyes. Within minutes, they forced their way into her cabin, demanding money, valuables, anything they believed an elderly woman living alone might have hidden away. Grace stayed calm, drawing on decades of quietly managing unruly students, and with a sudden burst of resolve, she created a distraction by knocking jars from a shelf, sending glass and canned tomatoes shattering across the floor. In the confusion, she slipped out the back door and into the snow-swept darkness. But the storm was unforgiving, and her injured ankles slowed her steps as she tried to reach the shed, her breath unsteady against the cold. The men were gaining on her when a low, haunting growl rose from the shadows, followed by 4 swift, powerful forms emerging like spirits of the wilderness itself. Copper in the lead, Blaze circling wide, Willow chittering sharply, and Misty moving with precise control. The Bobcats drove the men back toward their truck, their presence forceful enough to inspire panic without delivering lethal harm. And when the intruders fled down the mountain road, the night fell quiet once more. Grace, trembling and exhausted, watched the Bobcats gather around her in a protective arc, their golden eyes softening with a recognition that defied everything she had been told about wild animals forgetting their human caretakers. Step by step, they guided her back to her cabin, standing guard in the snow until Sheriff Daniel Brooks arrived at dawn. In the days that followed, Grace healed, installed a security system at Emily's urging, and adopted a gentle shelter dog for company. Yet the mountains held one final gift. On quiet spring evenings, she sometimes glimpsed 4 familiar shapes moving at the forest's edge, never close enough to tame the wildness they now carried, but always near enough to remind her that kindness, once offered freely, has a way of finding its way home.